Welcome to Module 8A, Tax Benefits for Education. By the end of this module, you will determine who qualifies for an education credit, determine which credit the taxpayer can claim, determine if the taxpayer has scholarship/grant income or eligible expenses. This module is broken down into 7 pieces: introduction to tax benefits, definition of key terms, eligibility, the American Opportunity Credit, the Lifetime Learning Credit. We'll have a recap, and then we'll end with a knowledge check. Let's introduce some tax benefits for education. This lesson covers tax credits available to help taxpayers offset the costs of higher education by reducing the amount of income tax. Education credits reduce the amount of tax due and are based on qualified education expenses that the taxpayer paid during the tax year. There are 2 different education credits: the American Opportunity Credit, AOC, or Lifetime Learning Credit, LLC. There are general rules that apply to these credits as well as specific rules for each credit. There are 2 ways education expenses can affect a tax return. For taxable scholarship/grant income, note, scholarship/grant income is reported on the student's return, regardless of who claims the credit. Or education expenses can be used as a tax credit, and this is the form of the AOC and LLC. Please note that these credits are calculated on the return of the taxpayer who is qualified to claim the student as a dependent. If no taxpayer can claim the student as a dependent, then the student claims the credit. During client intake, encountering any of the following items will require further investigation: a Form 1098-T, a tuition statement, an account statement from school, questions about scholarship income in Part 3 of the intake sheet answered yes, the question about education expenses in Part 4 of the intake sheet also answered yes. Let's talk about some key terms. An eligible institution is generally any accredited, public, nonprofit, or private college, university, vocational school, or post-secondary institution. If they're eligible to participate in a student aid program administered by the U.S. Department of Education, they are an eligible institution. The school should be able to tell the student if it is an eligible education institute. A searchable database of all accredited schools is available below. An eligible student is the taxpayer, spouse, or a dependent who is enrolled in 1 or more courses as an undergraduate or graduate student. Qualified education expenses include tuitions, fees that are required for enrollment, and course materials the student was required to buy from the school. The following are qualified education expenses for the purposes of determining the tax-free portion of scholarships and fellowships: tuitions and fees required to enroll at or attend an eligible education institute, course-related expenses such as fees, books, supplies, and equipment that are required for the courses at the eligible educational institute. These items must be required of all students in the course of instruction. Qualified education expenses may also include non-academic fees, such as student activity fees or other expenses unrelated to the academic course that must be paid to the institution as a condition of enrollment or attendance. A scholarship, grant, or fellowship is tax-free only if a student is a candidate for a degree at an eligible educational institute. A student is considered such if they're pursuing a degree at a college or university or attend an educational institute that offers a program of training to prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation and is authorized under federal or state law to provide such a program, as well as being accredited by a nationally recognized accreditation agency. A grant, scholarship, or fellowship is only tax-free to the extent that it doesn't exceed qualified education expenses, it isn't designated or earmarked for other purposes, such as room and board, and doesn't require that it can't be used for educational expenses. And finally, it doesn't represent payment for teaching, research, or other services required as a condition for receiving the scholarship. Here's the Form 1098-T. Eligible colleges or other post-secondary institutions must send Form 1098-T to any student who paid qualified educational expenses in the preceding tax year. A student account statement shows tuition, fees, and other expense payments received by the school for that student. It reflects any payments regardless of the payment's origin. It's available from the eligible institution and can be used to determine which fees paid to the institution are eligible. Let's talk about other eligibility to claim the education credits. To claim an education credit, the following must be true for the taxpayer. They cannot be claimed as a dependent. They are not married filing separately. Their AGI is below the limitations for their filing status. They were non-resident aliens for any part of the year, or if they were, they elected to be treated as resident aliens. Taxpayers who paid qualified educational expenses for higher education for an eligible student attending an eligible educational institute can claim an education credit. These expenses paid by a dependent or a third party for that dependent are considered paid by the taxpayer who can claim the student as a dependent. If a student isn't claimed as a dependent, only the student can claim the education credit, no matter who paid the expenses. This doesn't entitle the student to claim themselves on their tax return. Anyone paying the expenses are considered to have given a gift to the student, who in turn is treated as have paid the expenses. Let's talk about the AOC. In order to claim the American Opportunity Credit, students must have attended an eligible institution. It covers qualified expenses for tuition, fees, books, and supplies. 40% of the credit is refundable. The maximum credit amount is $2,500 per eligible student based on the $4,000 of qualifying expenses. It can be claimed for only 4 tax years. You must be enrolled for at least half-time. Any felony drug conviction by the student disqualifies them from claiming the credit. Married filing separately disqualifies you from the credit. It's available only if the student had not completed the first 4 years of post-secondary education before the tax year. If a student is under the age of 24 and claiming the American Opportunity Credit, none of the credit is refundable if 1. The taxpayer claiming the credit is under 18 or age 18 by the end of the year and their earned income was less than 1/2 of their own support, or a full-time student over 18 and under 24 and their earned income was less than 1/2 of their own support. As well as Part 2, the taxpayer has at least one living parent, and Part 3, the taxpayer does not file a joint return. What's the LLC? The Lifetime Learning Credit is a non-refundable tax credit. It covers undergrad, graduate, and courses to acquire or improve job skills. The maximum credit is $2,000 per tax return on $10,000 of qualified expenses. The calculation is 20% of eligible expenses until the $2,000 limit is reached. You must attend an eligible institution. Qualified expenses include tuitions and fees. Books only if bought from the educational institution as a condition of enrollment, so rarely do books ever qualify for the LLC. Per return, expenses for multiple students can be combined to increase qualified expenses toward the overall $10,000 maximum. And you can be a less than half-time student. Let's recap. Taxpayers must have a Form 1098-T and a copy of a student account statement in order to claim an education credit. Taxable scholarship or grant income is reported on the student's return when the amount exceeds qualifying education expenses. Tax credits are reported on the tax return of the taxpayer who can claim the student as a dependent. The student only claims the credit if no one claims them as a dependent. In some cases, you can report scholarships as incomes taxable to the student in order to maximize education credits. This here is a chart comparing education credits. Feel free to pause the recording now in order to review them. Now we're going to end with a knowledge check. We have a Module 8 quiz as well as a few Dear Iris letters. Up next, Module 8B, eligible expenses.